Unlike many of you here in this room, I am not a scientist. I am instead a journalist. And because I'm a journalist, I know that reporters often have a superficial knowledge of the topics about which they write. They often have no inkling of the historical context, and they often miss the internal politics of a situation. So in about 2009, early 2009, it seemed to me that every time I picked up a newspaper or opened a magazine or turned on the radio, global warming was being talked about. It was this background, nagging, droning theme of modern life. And I started to do a little bit of research on my own for the first time. I'd never written at all about global warming, really anything to do with the environment. And it didn't take me long to discover something that all of you know, and that's that there is actually a wide range of scientific opinion about climate change. The problem is that that diversity of opinion is not reflected in media reports usually, most of the time. So I decided to write a book that would tell the public that there was this diversity of opinion. But eventually, I ended up writing a totally different book, and it is an examination of a United Nations body known as the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, writing an expose of an organization that most people have never heard of is not the most lucrative thing I could have been doing with my time. But I think that this book makes an important contribution because even if most people have never heard of the IPCC, our governments have. Now I'm going to try this clicker and see if it works. There we go. Okay. Now, if you write to your elected representatives expressing doubt about climate change policies, you will almost certainly receive a reply back that talks about the IPCC. I'm from Canada, and this is a letter from the Alberta Ministry of the Environment and Water. Alberta is a province in Canada. And it's advising a member of the public that the Alberta government, quote, acknowledges the findings of the IPCC. Now, this is another document. It's available on the Government of Alberta website. On the page that follows, the table of contents, one of the first things we hear about is the great IPCC. Now, it's important to understand that Alberta is the home of Canada's oil sands. Fossil fuels are the backbone of Alberta's booming economy. Moreover, political conservatives have governed that part of my country for decades. If big oil can be expected to be calling the shots anywhere, it's surely in Alberta. And yet, even in Alberta, the IPCC is considered authoritative. And it is a similar story the world over. In Australia, where I spent 2 weeks this summer on a speaking tour, in the UK, where I was a few days ago, the EU, the United Nations, virtually any country you care to name, officials at all levels, from the smallest villages to national portfolios, they have all been telling us that we need to fight climate change because the IPCC says so. Now, as I've mentioned, I have no scientific background. I'm therefore not qualified to determine whether the IPCC's interpretation of the science is valid. I don't have the background to do that. But there is something I'm fully capable of doing, and that is asking some very basic questions about an organization. So at some point, I realized something rather remarkable, and that's even though the IPCC has been around for a quarter of a century, it's going to celebrate its 25th anniversary next year, even though it won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007, even though it is relied on by governments far and wide, no other journalist has asked these very rudimentary questions about the IPCC. Questions like, does the IPCC describe its own personnel accurately? Does it describe the material it takes into consideration accurately? Does it follow its own rules? Are there enforcement mechanisms to ensure that those rules get followed? And does its leadership inspire confidence? So let's start with question number 1. Does the IPCC describe its own personnel accurately? Now, actually, let me just back up for a moment and point out that none of these questions has anything to do with Arctic ice melt or solar physics or the medieval warm period. These are simple, straightforward questions that everyone, whether they are a scientist or not, can understand. And that's why I think they're very useful questions to ask. So, does the IPCC describe its own personnel accurately? Now, this is Rajendra Pachauri. He has been the chairman of the IPCC for the past decade. And a few years back, when discussing IPCC report authors, here's what he told a newspaper. Quote, "These are people who are chosen on the basis of their track record, on their record of publications, on the research they have done. They are people who are at the top of their profession." But those claims turn out to be nonsense. A number of talented and experienced scientists have indeed helped to write IPCC reports over the years. The problem is that many other IPCC authors don't come close to being leading scientists at the top of their profession. So here are a few of the very young, very inexperienced people that I just happened to stumble across. Richard Klein is currently a geography professor in the Netherlands. He became an IPCC lead author at the tender age of 25. And 3 years later, he was promoted to coordinating lead author, which means he was in charge of an IPCC chapter. Now, he didn't actually finish his PhD until sometime later. Laurens Bauer is another gentleman from the Netherlands. He was a lead author in 1999. That was prior to earning his master's degree. In fact, it would be 11 years from the time he started contributing to IPCC reports until he got his doctorate. And Sari Kovacs is perhaps the most egregious example that I found. Back in 1994, Sari Kovacs was one of only 21 people in the entire world who was chosen to write a very important chapter in the IPCC report on how climate change might affect human health. Now, remember Pachauri saying that people are chosen on the basis of their publication record? He wasn't talking about her because it would be 3 years later before she published her very first paper. She only received her PhD in 2010, which means she was considered one of the world's top experts 16 years before earning her doctorate degree. And is the IPCC embarrassed about this? Well, actually, no, because she is currently leading a chapter on the IPCC report that is now underway. It's called AR5. The previous one in 2007 was called AR4 for Assessment Report 4. So she, in fact, has spent the last 15 years of her life writing IPCC reports. She has been involved. So yesterday we heard from Dr. Paul Ryder, the malaria expert. The IPCC didn't invite him to contribute to that very important chapter which spoke a lot about malaria. They chose SARS-CoV instead. Now, other IPCC authors turn out to be professional activists who are actually employed by green lobby groups. Now, Richard Moss has been involved with the IPCC for 2 decades, and during part of that time, he was actually a vice president of the World Wildlife Fund. He was cashing a paycheck from the World Wildlife Fund. And Bill Hare, you can go on the internet, and if you Google Greenpeace legend Bill Hare, you will find that that is how he is referred to internally at Greenpeace. He is a legend amongst Greenpeace activists. And in 2007, when the IPCC wrote its synthesis report, he was one of only 40 people in the world whom the IPCC chose to entrust with that very important task. So if you look into the heart of the IPCC, you find Greenpeace. Now, here are just a few more professional activists. There are others, but I'm just choosing a few. Michael Oppenheimer was employed for more than 20 years by the Environmental Defense Fund, which is a very wealthy, very influential green lobby group in the United States. He continues to serve as an advisor to that green lobby group, and he too is now involved in the upcoming IPCC report. He is leading a chapter. And then there is Jennifer Morgan. Now, I think Jennifer in this photograph looks perfectly delightful. I think she'd be great to have a drink with. I think she just looks like a very vivacious personality. The problem is that Jennifer is not one of the world's finest scientific minds. Jennifer has spent her entire career working for one green lobby group after another. And in fact, at a certain point, she was the lead spokesperson on climate change for the WWF. She now, too, is involved in preparing the upcoming IPCC report. Now, what is a WWF climate change spokesperson doing within a mile of a scientific assessment? What is she doing there? How could the IPCC mistake her for one of the world's top scientists? Now, speaking of the WWF, something very curious happened around 2004, and that's that the WWF, just at the time that the last IPCC report was getting underway, the WWF began recruiting specifically IPCC personnel to participate in its own panel of scientists. And by 2008, according to documents, again, that are freely available on the web, these are not secret by any means, the WWF said it was successful in persuading 130 people that it described as leading climate scientists, mostly but not exclusively from the IPCC, to join its panel. So at the very moment when the world entrusted those leading climate scientists to be neutral and objective in assessing the scientific evidence and what it tells us about climate change, those 130 leading climate scientists decided to get into bed with a green lobby group. Those leading climate scientists couldn't figure out that that was a totally improper thing for them to be doing. So what does it mean that there were all of these people affiliated with the WWF who were also working on AR4? Well, what it means is that 2/3 of the chapters in the last big IPCC report had at least one WWF-affiliated scientist working on it. And in fact, 1/3 of the chapters was led by a WWF-affiliated scientist. And in a particular chapter that examined the very important question of species extinction and climate change, there were in fact 8 people affiliated with the WWF deciding what that chapter should say, including both of the coordinating lead authors. Both of the leaders of the chapter had affiliations. Now, when my book came out last year, the WWF headquarters in Switzerland issued a press release, and they were very upset because in my book I say that the WWF had infiltrated the IPCC, and they said, "Oh no, that's not the case. That's a ludicrous word to use. There was some overlap, just a bit of overlap. Well, when 2/3 of your chapters include at least one person, I don't think that's some overlap. I think that's a full-scale invasion." So, does the IPCC describe its own personnel accurately? It tells us that these are the world's best scientists at the top of their profession. And what do we find when we decide to just look under the hood just a little bit? We find students, we find activists, we find scientists publicly linked to green lobbyists. Does the IPCC describe the material it takes into consideration accurately? Here's Chairman Pachauri again. Now this is what he said to the North Carolina, a committee of the North Carolina State Legislature in February 2008. This is what he told those lawmakers. He says, "These are the best experts and scientists from all over the world. Everything we look at and take into account has to have the credibility of peer-reviewed publications. We don't settle for anything less than peer review," is what he told the North Carolina lawmakers. And then he told the New Zealand Herald, "People can have confidence in the IPCC given that it's all on the basis of peer-reviewed literature." And then he said to the Times of India, when they asked him whether the next IPCC report might consider a discussion paper that had been prepared by the Environment Ministry of India, and which questioned whether glaciers were melting quite as quickly as the IPCC said, he said, "That's just a discussion paper, it's not peer-reviewed. If they wanted to take their data and get it published in the peer-reviewed literature, I'm sure we would look at it, but otherwise it belongs in the dustbin." Okay, so there's nothing ambiguous about these statements. He's saying everything we look at has to carry the credibility of being peer-reviewed, and if it is not being peer-reviewed, it belongs in the dustbin. Now, early in 2010, I read a blog post, and it was written by an economist named Richard Tall. And in that blog post, he complained. He said the IPCC was writing about topic X, and they ignored all the peer-reviewed literature and the conclusions of the peer-reviewed literature on topic X, and instead they cited gray literature to say something totally different from what the peer-reviewed literature claims. And I said, "Wait a minute, what do you mean they cited gray literature? I thought it was all 100% peer-reviewed." So I went to the chapter online. I had never done that before. I went to the chapter of the IPCC report he was talking about. I went to the end of the chapter where all of the references were listed. I looked at those references, and then I took a highlighter and I said, okay, that's a peer-reviewed journal, that's a peer-reviewed journal, that's not. And then I added them all up. And I found out that a considerable number of the sources being cited by the IPCC were not from peer-reviewed sources at all. So then I thought, well, did I find the one chapter out of 44 that, was kind of a little sketchy? And so then I looked at another chapter, and then I realized that I needed help because there are, in fact, 44 chapters in the last IPCC report. There are more than 18,000 references, and in order to do an assessment of how many of them were actually peer-reviewed journals and how many of them were other source material, I needed help. So I asked people who read my blog to help me, and in 5 weeks, we counted up all the references, and in fact, every chapter was examined by 3 people independently. We got a number, and then we discovered that, things were a little not quite as they had been described. So this is an official IPCC graphic, and that's the graphic we made when we did the press release at the end. So there were 40 people from 12 different countries who volunteered to help me with this task. We took 4 weeks to count and 1 week to write a report, and we discovered that there were thousands upon thousands of references in the IPCC report to material that is described as gray literature, that is in fact not peer-reviewed. So the F21 means that there were 21 chapters. Virtually half of the chapters had so few peer-reviewed references that on a grade school report card, they would have received an F. So 60% or less. That's how bad it is. So 1 in 3 was the final total. 1 in 3, 30%. So, and people say, 30%. Well, if you don't think 30% is a significant number, the next time you get your paycheck, take 30% and give it to charity and see if you notice, right? So, how could this be? But that's the way it is. There were 18,500 references roughly, and 5,600 of them were not to peer-reviewed sources. Some of those sources being quoted by the IPCC were press releases. Some of them were material written by Greenpeace. Some of them were discussion papers. Some of them were newspaper clippings. There was a wide range of material, but by no means is it 100% based on peer-reviewed sources. So, does the IPCC describe the material accurately? So question number 3, does the IPCC follow its own rules? Once again, let's turn to Chairman Pachauri. Now, it's 2007, and the IPCC is about to release installment number 2 of its brand new report. And a journalist asked Chairman Pachauri about the Stern Review. And the Stern Review was a 700-page report written by some UK government employees, and the journalist wanted to know whether the Stern Review had been cited in the IPCC report. Perfectly legitimate question. And this, unlike all the other quotes, is not verbatim from Pachauri. It's the journalist's paraphrase, but again, there's not a lot of ambiguity. Pachauri suggests that, yes, we're aware of the Stern Review, but our ability to use it is limited because it's not peer-reviewed, okay? It would be improper to use it. That was the gist of his comments. And, that's perfectly reasonable. Sounds like Pachauri's concerned about the rules. Why is that statement significant? Well, because once again, Pachauri misled us. Now, this is just a screenshot of a blog post, one of the blog posts I wrote, because I realized that, in fact, the Stern Review was quoted by the IPCC report, not once or twice, but 26 times across 12 different chapters. And on one page, in fact, it was cited 5 times. So in the universe inhabited by the chairman of the IPCC, he believed there was a rule that said it was improper to cite the Stern Review because it's not peer-reviewed. So because they cited the Stern Review, I count that as broken rule number 1. But there's a broken rule number 2. Now, the IPCC had deadlines about what material they could consider when they were writing their report and what had to be wait until the next report. When you have thousands of people working together on a project, you need some ground rules. So the IPCC had a cutoff date, and they said, we'll consider material that, according to Pachauri, was completed before January 2006. So essentially he's saying the end of 2005. We stopped there. When do you suppose the Stern Review was released? The end of October 2006. He said we didn't consider anything after the end of 2005. Now, so the quote I showed you a moment ago is from this same article in a Yale University publication. And one of the things Dr. Pachauri likes to brag about is that there are so many people involved in producing IPCC reports. There are so many eyes looking at this report. And, the suggestion is that that helps to avoid errors. And, it does sound impressive. It sounds very impressive conceptually. So he said in the same place, in the same article, that the previous quote came from about the deadline, he said we had 2,500 expert reviewers. Trust us, there were lots of us looking at our report. Well, the problem is that the expert reviewers had a deadline as well. So the deadline for the expert reviewers is they had to read the review, or the report, they had to submit their comments no later than, let me just find this place, September 15th. So the Stern Review comes out on October 30th. So it means all those 2,500 reviewers had all done their job and gone home before the Stern Review was even published and before its material in the Stern Review got added into the IPCC report. So from three different perspectives, therefore, the peer review issue, the cutoff date for material that could be considered, and the expert review process, citing the Stern Review was entirely illegitimate. It should never have happened. How did all of those references get there? Why didn't the authors of the 12 chapters in which that new material was added in after the fact, why didn't they raise a fuss? Now, does this sound to you like a conscientious organization where people are working hard to preserve the integrity of the process? Or is this an organization where all sorts of shady things appear to be going on? So are there enforcement mechanisms? Now, it's important to understand when the 2007 report was released, the IPCC wasn't called on any of this. Journalists didn't write articles saying, yeah, but they broke this rule and they did this and they didn't follow their policy here. There was none of that at all. In fact, quite the opposite. The IPCC report was praised and lauded. Governments around the world held press conferences. Journalists gushed. A few months later, the IPCC was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. So does it sound to you like anything bad happens when people writing IPCC reports disregard the rules? In my book, I say that the IPCC has gone to the trouble to write down policies and procedures, and that on paper they sound very good. They sound very impressive. But that's a bit like posting speed limit signs and then not hiring any traffic police. We all know what happens, even when there are police officers and radar guns and red light cameras. People still break the law. What do we think happens in an organization where everyone knows there are no traffic cops? You break the law, nothing bad happens to you. There are no consequences. So we come back to perhaps the most important question of all, the face of the IPCC, its leadership. Does it inspire confidence? Are you impressed by Chairman Pachauri? He apparently can't tell the difference between a student and a scientist at the top of their profession. He apparently can't distinguish a real scientist from a Greenpeace employee. He's been chairman of the IPCC for a decade, but he apparently did not know that 30% of the references in AR4 were to gray literature. He apparently had no idea that the Stern Review had in fact been cited by the IPCC in 12 different chapters. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the IPCC. Ask some rudimentary questions, and it becomes clear beyond any doubt that this is not a credible organization. These people are not trustworthy. The fact that journalists have failed to properly scrutinize the IPCC for the last 25 years is shameful, and the fact that governments continue to rely on the IPCC is scandalous. Okay.